several years ago, there was a website that was very popular called Ancestry.com. You ever heard of that? Ancestry.com. My grandmother is an Ancestry.com fanatic. Every time I talk to her, I hear about how we are directly descended from Pocahontas. And in fact, I learned from that actually Spencer Strickland and I are related. So you can learn all kinds of cool things. You can learn about your family tree, who you really are, things you didn't know previously. But there's a feature on Ancestry.com, at least there was, I'm not sure about now, but there was a feature where you could submit a DNA test. You could send in a sample of your saliva to Ancestry.com, and they could tell you all kinds of things. They could estimate your ethnicity through that DNA test. They could give you like this pie chart and tell you you're this percent Scots-Irish, this percent Native American or French or German or whatever that is, which was pretty cool to see where you came from, your family of origin. That DNA test could link you with other people that had also submitted their DNA, so you could find like long-lost relatives that you didn't even know existed, which would be pretty cool. There's also a feature on there that could predict your traits, your physical traits, your personality traits. It could predict whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. It could predict things like if you can remember your dreams more readily than other people. It could predict hair color, eye color, all different kinds of cool things like that. But this DNA test, it showed a lot of people more clearly who they were. And people came to a much deeper realization, I wasn't really who I thought I was because of this DNA test. Now, with that being said, I want to ask you this question as we set the stage for our lesson this morning. What if we were to take a DNA test on our level of discipleship? What if we were to take a DNA test on our personal commitment to Jesus Christ? What would we see? What would we realize? All of us are disciples of Jesus Christ. If you claim to be a Christian, if you have been identified with Jesus Christ by believing in Him, by saying, I'm not gonna do things my way anymore. I'm going to do things God's way, and you're living by that. If you've been immersed in the waters of baptism, contacting His blood, if you claim to be a Christian, you're also claiming to be a disciple. A disciple is a follower of Jesus, one who adheres to the teachings and ways of Jesus Christ. And all of us are different kinds of disciples. Don't get me wrong. All of us have different kinds of personalities. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. We all have different kinds of, we're all at different levels of spiritual maturity in our discipleship, in our following Jesus. All of us have different gifts and talents that we use to glorify God and advance the kingdom. However, there are certain core traits that each disciple of Jesus Christ needs to have and needs to be becoming within their lives. And I want to ask the question, what are those traits? What are the core traits of a disciple of Jesus Christ? What's the DNA of a disciple, of a true disciple that belongs to Jesus and is following Him? This morning, we're going to open up our Bibles and we're going to turn to John chapter 1. We've looked at the first part of John chapter 1 where the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, setting the stage for Jesus and His coming. Last week, we looked at the middle part of John chapter 1, and we looked at John the Baptist, how he points the way to Jesus Christ which mirrors our purpose and our identity to be those who also point the way to Jesus. And what we're going to see in the last part of John chapter 1 is Jesus, He begins to call His disciples. He begins to call followers of His that's going to follow Him, that's going to listen to His teachings, obey His teachings, live by His teachings, and teach others to hear His teachings and live by His teaching. In the last part of John chapter 1, Jesus begins to call His disciples. And what we see here are not only who the disciples are. We see disciples like Peter and Andrew and Philip and Nathaniel. But the purpose of this text isn't just to tell us the identity of these disciples, what their names are and who they are. Rather, the purpose of this text, I believe, is to tell us what kinds of people these are, what kind of people these are, what their DNA is. And that's what we're going to be examining this morning. We're going to be looking at core traits, common characteristics, the DNA of the disciples that Jesus calls to Himself. And if you want to make this sermon applicable to you, and you want to take this message out into your life and apply it to your life, I want you to ask yourself this question as we go through this passage. Is the DNA of a disciple also my DNA? And is that what I am becoming within my life? All right, let's jump into the text together. Let's look at, first of all, John chapter 1. Let's open up and look at verse 35. John chapter 1, starting in verse 35. Let's read verses 35 through 37. Again, the next day, John stood with two of his disciples. That's John the Baptist, like we talked about last week. And looking at Jesus as He walked, he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard Him speak, and they followed Jesus. So, first of all, in our text, we're introduced to these two disciples. At first, they're not named. One of them isn't named within the text. And the second one turns out to be Andrew. We'll see that later in the text. But this unnamed disciple and Andrew, they're following John. And John points to Jesus and says, again, "Behold, the Lamb of God." There He is. And these two disciples, they begin to follow Jesus. They begin to follow Jesus. And Jesus sees them following Him, and Jesus asks them a question. And that's where we pick up in our text. I want you to notice verse 38. Then Jesus turned and seeing them following, said to them, "What do you seek?" They said to Him, "Rabbi," which is to say, when translated, "Teacher, where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where He was staying, and they remained with Him that day. Now it was about the 10th hour. So these two disciples, they start following Jesus, and Jesus turns to ask them a question. He says, what are you seeking? Which is basically saying, what do you want? What is it that you want? In other words, why are you following me? Now, in asking this, Jesus is really probing their motives. He's searching deep into their heart, and He wants to see the reason why they're following Him. Jesus wants to know, are these people following me just because of this superficial, idle kind of curiosity? Like, there's a lot of hype around Jesus right now because John is pointing to Him. He's saying that He's the Christ. He's saying that He's the Lamb of God. He's saying that He's the one that's going to take away the sin of the world. Are these people following Jesus just because they are just kind of, hey, who's this dude? And who is He all about? Or do they have this sincere desire to know who Jesus is. That's the reason why Jesus asks that question. What are you seeking? What do you want? Why are you following me? And then the disciples respond to Jesus' question with a question. Notice what they say. They say, where are you staying? And in asking that, the disciples, they're not just wanting Jesus' address so they can send him a postcard from Timbuktu when they go on vacation. That's not the reason why they ask him this. They ask him, where are you staying? They want to know where he's going to be because they want to be with him. They want to go and interview him. They want to go ask him questions. They want to know him. They want to know what he's all about, know what he's going to teach. They want to follow him and be his disciples. And if you look within the text, it's kind of implied that they stayed with Jesus overnight, just asking him questions, interviewing him, and having this deep desire, this longing to know Jesus and to follow him. Now, as we attempt to understand what the DNA of a disciple is, I think we see it right here. The DNA of a disciple is one who comes to Jesus, not with this superficial level of curiosity or maybe, this is kind of a cool guy, he's entertaining, he benefits me, he does a lot of cool things, I get a show out of it. That's not the DNA of a disciple. The DNA of a disciple is one who comes to Jesus and says, I want to know you. I want to know you even if it costs me something. If you notice in the Gospels, this is really contrary to the crowds that come to Jesus. A lot of the time, crowds will gather around Jesus, and we'll see this later as we progress through the book of John here. But the crowds react. The way they react to Jesus, many of them are driven by this kind of surface level curiosity. You get to John chapter 6, and many of them start to follow Jesus because he's performing signs and he's performing miracles. I mean, he's doing a lot of cool stuff. Like, whoa, dude, who's this guy? What is he all about? Can he do something for me? Maybe he can heal me. Maybe he can give me something that I don't have. The text seems to imply that many people, the crowds, were following him because Jesus could give them something, because Jesus could bless them. And in fact, if you get farther within the text, after the feeding of the 5,000 story in John chapter 6, Jesus just specifically identifies the reason why. He says, many of you are following me, not because you desire to know truth, but you want free food. You want me to perform a miracle and give you food. So oftentimes within the Gospels, we see the crowd here having this kind of superficial level of curiosity in wanting to follow Jesus. However, that curiosity, it often evaporated. It vanished away when the cost became clear. You read later in John chapter 6 in that same story, and Jesus starts saying crazy things like, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, I mean, you have no life in you. I mean, you have no share with me. He says, I am the bread of life. Anyone who comes to me will no longer hunger. And the text says that when people started to hear these things, it's like, whoa, okay. He's not giving me what I want anymore. And then at that point, many of the people departed and left because Jesus wasn't living up to their expectations. And I think it's interesting, the crowd here, all the crowds, the crowd that cried, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna to the Son of David. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem in his triumphal entry, like they're all in, they're loyal, they're committed. But it's that same city that cries just a couple days later, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Jesus stopped giving them what they wanted. He stopped entertaining them. He stopped amazing them. He stopped benefiting them in the moment. And when the cost became clear, they no longer had this desire to know Jesus. Now, what does that tell us, church? That tells us that the DNA of a disciple is the exact opposite. The DNA of one who follows Jesus is to stay with and follow Him even when He stops amazing them, when He stops entertaining them, when He stops benefiting them and blessing them. Why? Why do they stay? Why do they remain like these disciples remain in John chapter 1? Because they want to know Him. Because they know that He is someone special. They know that He is the way to life. And no matter if it costs me something, no matter if it costs me discomfort, no matter if I have to give up something, if I have to rid myself of something that I once held dear because I now realize it's sinful and it's wrong, I'm going to stay with Jesus. I'm going to remain with Jesus. I'm going to hold on to Him because I want to know Him, even if it costs me something. Church, that is a disciple. That's the DNA of one who follows Jesus Christ. And that's not to say that a disciple never goes through periods of spiritual dryness. That's not to say that, we don't, sometimes our hearts are like balloons, right? I mean, we get inflated and then they deflate. We get discouraged, and they need to be pumped up. We need to be around fellow Christians who encourage us. We need to saturate ourselves with the Word of God. I'm not saying that we'll never go through periods of discouragement and dryness and times when we just don't feel as fruitful. But what it does mean, and what it means for us as we persist in discipleship, is that we still have this urge to know Him and obey Him, even when I don't understand. When I ask why. Why did things have to happen this way? Why is my life not looking the way that I think it should look? I feel so much pressure. I feel pressure, stress, anxiety from all different kinds of sources. I see relational conflict, and I experience all of these negative things in my life. What a disciple does through those times is they say, I know how I feel in the moment, and it's not pleasant, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trust in Jesus. I'm going to stay with Him. I'm going to obey Him. I'm going to do what He says because I want to know Him. I trust, I believe that He is the only path to life. Is that your DNA? Is that your DNA? Or is it your DNA to allow your circumstances, whatever they may be, to drive your loyalty and your commitment to Jesus? When faced with negative circumstances, does your heart turn away from Jesus and no longer trust Him and no longer obey Him? Or when faced with negative circumstances, is your heart one that says, I know the way I feel right now in the moment, but I'm committed to Him. I trust Him, and I'm going to remain with Him. Is that in your DNA? Let's continue in the text here. Notice with me in verse 40. Verse 40 through 46 here. Verse 40 of John chapter 1. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Now when Jesus looked at him, He said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. you shall be called Cephas, which is translated a stone. So one of the disciples that begin to follow Jesus, Andrew, he says, I got a brother. I want to bring him to Jesus. I want him to know Jesus because he's the Messiah, because he's the Christ. And if you look at his name here, Simon, or the Hebrew equivalent Simeon, Simon or Simeon, Andrew brings his brother Simon or Simeon to Jesus. And now, Simeon, that name, it should ring a bell, to those that are familiar with Jacob's sons. Remember Jacob's 12 sons. His second oldest son was Simeon. If you can remember anything about Simeon, Simeon had this rash, abrasive, impulsive, almost vengeful kind of like personality. Remember his sister Dinah and that whole thing where he kills all of these people to take vengeance on something that they did against him. Like he has this vengeful and impulsive personality. That's the same name that Simon Peter has, Simeon, Simon. And what a lot of scholars say, the biblical commentators say, when Jesus changes his name from Simeon to Cephas, he's saying, look, you're going to also have an identity change as well. If you look at Peter in the Gospels, Peter's personality kind of mimics that of Simeon. He's impulsive, he's rash, he's, what do people call him, impetuous Peter. He speaks before he thinks in a lot of circumstances. And when he comes to Jesus, Jesus gives him basically a new identity. He says, no, you're going to be called Cephas from now on, which is translated a stone or a rock, something that is secure and stable and steadfast. You know what I believe that's telling us? When we bring people to Jesus, what does Jesus do with that? What does Jesus do with that? He changes them. Despite their negative character, despite even if they're people like Simeon, like this vengeful, fleshly, earthly, vindictive kind of person, when they come to Jesus, Jesus says, I'm going to give you a new character. I'm going to give you a new kind of identity. And all that, the reason why that is because Andrew brought his brother to Jesus. Now here's my point. That's what disciples do. That's the DNA of a disciple. A disciple is someone who is thoroughly convinced that transformation is only found in Jesus Christ. And because of that belief, they say, come and see. Come and see Jesus. They bring people to Jesus. In fact, that's what happens in the next story. If you look in verses 46 through 43 through 46, we don't have time to read it, but Philip brings Nathanael to Jesus. So what we see are disciples constantly in this text bringing people to Jesus, so they can be changed, so they can be transformed. Now, what does that tell us a disciple is? A disciple is one who is mission-minded. A disciple is one who says this: who is the next person that I'm going to bring to Jesus? Who's the next person? Maybe someone that I work with, or I go to school with, or is in my circle of influence, that I know does not have a relationship with Jesus, but is searching. Who can I bring to the feet of Jesus? Like Andrew and Philip within this text. That's a disciple. That's a disciple. And if that's not in our DNA, church, if it's not in our DNA to be looking amongst our relationships with the world and say, we need to be bringing people to the feet of Jesus, but just kind of casually sit back and let all these people that we know, all these relationships that we have, be wastes in regards to our witness of Jesus Christ. That's the opposite of what a disciple is. A disciple is one who constantly asks, who can we bring to Jesus? How can we grow the kingdom? How can we advance the mission? I think, church, it would astonish us. I really do. I really believe this. I really believe that it would astonish us if we knew how many people in our community were searching for truth. I've heard from people before, nobody wants truth. Nobody wants Jesus anymore. Nobody wants New Testament Christianity. Nobody wants that stuff anymore. You know, from what I hear around the world, from the brotherhood, I mean, that's not what I'm seeing. There are a lot of people, multitudes of people that are searching for something real, for something lasting, for truth. And I sincerely believe, and I hope you do too, that those people are right next door to us. I think it would amaze us at how many people want truth. And you know what we have, what we claim to have? We claim to have the truth. What we need to do is to get up. Things right now, but if you commit to this, if you stay with this, if you remain loyal to the journey, you're going to see and experience something even greater, much greater things, much greater things. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us that it's in the DNA of a disciple to remain loyal and committed to the journey. And when they do, they see and experience much greater things. I know when you first become a Christian, when you first become a disciple, you're all excited in the moment. And then what happens to a lot of people is they go through their spiritual journey and they kind of lose that passion, lose that zeal. And oftentimes through that, people end up sitting on the sidelines and don't really focus on growth, focus on using their gifts and their talents. But what I believe away with this, even in times where I do go through the spiritual dry periods and I just don't feel as zealous, I don't feel as passionate. I feel maybe like obeying Jesus is more of a burden, than anything else. When you stick with it, and when you say, despite how I feel, I feel like this isn't doing anything, but I'm going to obey Jesus. I'm going to persist in the spiritual disciplines, and I'm going to grow. What often happens is, as you grow in relationship with Jesus Christ, you see and experience much greater things, a much greater love and affection come for Jesus Christ. I mean, prayer no longer becomes a burden that, okay, I got to get up and do this. I got to read my Bible. It becomes something that I crave and I desire. Like, I need to pray. If I don't pray, I'm going to feel lost. If I don't read my Bible, I'm going to feel drained and dry, and life's not going to be worth living. It's kind of like a marriage. When you first get married, a lot of the times you've got to force yourself to love and to humble yourself. But over time, what happens? Those feelings grow, attachment grows, relationship grows, and it becomes something that I sincerely want to do. I want to sacrifice. I want to give. I want to bless. If you stay with Jesus, if you stay committed to the journey, much greater things will come. Following Jesus will be just this absolute joy that I want to make a part of my life. That's the DNA, I believe, of a disciple. One who says, I am committed to the journey, even if it feels like a burden, even if it feels difficult in the moment. I'm going to stay true to this because I believe much greater things will come. That's the DNA of a disciple. So, church, is this our DNA? What's in our discipleship DNA? Is it this attitude? I want to know Jesus despite how much it costs. I want to bring others to Jesus, even if I have to get out of my comfort zone. Is it I'm committed to the journey with Jesus, even though it might be difficult in the moment? Now, if you look at the disciples, Jesus' disciples here in the text, they had flaws. They didn't do everything perfectly, and neither will we. But God used them, and He will use us to accomplish His purposes. If these things are the things that we are becoming, and we are persisting Him in, and making these core traits a part of who we are. And oh church, how our church, how our community, how our world would be so different if every single disciple of Jesus Christ made these traits a part of their own heart. What's in your DNA? This morning, if anyone has any need, if anyone needs prayers, needs to confess sin, or needs to begin relationship with Jesus, we urge you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.